You are listening to Wild Roots. Today we're speaking with Christopher Ketcham, journalist and author of This Land: How Cowboys, Capitalism, and Corruption Are Ruining the American West. First of all, I just have to say, for anyone who has ever been moved by a beautiful wild landscape, or has made memories in a wild special place, or who simply loves and appreciates nature and are concerned with protecting our natural heritage, read this book. I cannot recommend it enough. In fact, I wish I could buy several copies and hand them out myself. The information in This Land provides profound insight into what is happening in the interior of our own western United States, our own forests and wildernesses, most importantly in our own public lands. That's your land. Hideous and somewhat terroristic and largely illegal operations occur in our public lands with the assistance of multiple land and wildlife management agencies. This book is a very thorough account of what's been happening and what is happening still, despite these atrocities and assaults on nature in the West. So read it, and you can draw your own conclusions from there. Before reading this book myself, I had to really put myself in check and prepare myself mentally and meditatively to be able to read it, because I just knew it was going to hit where it hurt the most for me. The condoning of efforts to exterminate native wildlife and the degradation of our last wild places, all for a particular interest. Profit, of course. Public land grazing and its consequences are pretty much topics of continual discussion for me, in which I am extremely passionate. And I just knew that this book was going to verify a lot of beliefs I had about the harms of this industry, atop what I already knew. And this book just took that to a whole new level. So with that, I just have to thank you, Chris, first and foremost, for writing this book and for all of the efforts and research you did to obtain the information and data for this. It's truly a blessing of sorts, in my opinion, that you wrote this.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. It was my pleasure. Actually, it wasn't really pleasurable. It was awful. But
I can imagine that being true. I feel it too. Well, reaching out to you is just one way I feel I can help expose this ecocidal corruption taking place on our public lands. So Chris, let's start off with the fact that most people don't even recognize there's a problem in our public lands, or, don't have the skill sets to see degraded landscapes or watersheds, and that most people don't even know public land grazing is even a thing. I would say that's probably true for most of the United States population. So explain to our listeners what is happening in terms of public land grazing.
I think you're right. Most people are unaware of the widespread grazing of livestock on the public lands. Most people, I think, most Americans, especially people living outside the interior West or the Intermountain West, don't even know that they are collective owners of public lands. The whole question of grazing, I think, doesn't become something of public concern because public sees cows on a Western landscape and thinks of them as quote unquote natural fauna. and
Nope.
And fail to understand that these are in fact invasive species that are very destructive, especially in the arid lands where you've got flora that are not adapted to the presence of these big water-loving bovines. The public also thinks of the West as the land of the cowboy. And so cows go with cowboys. And so the image of the West is one of righteous, self-reliant, independent, sturdy, manly cowboys riding the range. It's all a bunch of crap.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a lie. Um, and I think the public also doesn't know that public lands are pillaged for oil and gas and coal and gold and silver, and or that public lands are overrun in many places by off-road vehicles, or that our national forests are logged at rock bottom rates um, for corporations, timber companies, and corporations that are subsidized by taxpayers to steal our lumber,
Right.
and then leave forests, the homes of beautiful other than human creatures, right?
Mm-hmm.
Leave those forests a wreck. So yeah, I think people are generally unaware. I mean, that
Yeah.
one guy, friend of mine, when I asked him, and this is just part of a sort of informal survey I was doing randomly with people to see if they knew what the BLM was. Well, I asked him what the BLM was. And this guy's an educated lawyer in his 50s. He was like, yeah, Black Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I remember reading that. I took so many notes reading this book, pages of notes. I was sort of treating it like a textbook because it's just a wealth of information. And this topic of discussion is pretty regular for me. I am a biologist, an ecologist, and I do watershed restoration work, and we see this all the time. It's just pervasive.
And you
And
see the effects of overgrazing and the damage to especially riparian zones.
right, yeah. So, I mean, in chapter 3, you quoted Aldo Leopold's quote, and it says, one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Much of the damage inflicted on the land is quite invisible to laymen. An ecologist must be the doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise. And this quote's super significant to me because as an ecologist, I see degraded landscapes everywhere in the Southwest where I live, and it always points to the same cause: overgrazing. And the worst part of it is that these degraded landscapes are seen as normal to people. They're just like, oh yeah, look at that beautiful countryside with cows, and there's nothing left. And it's so incredibly frustrating because it's just all pervasive, it's the norm for so many people that don't know otherwise.
Right. So one of the sources who was profiled in my book, Mary O'Brien, who's a biologist and a grazing activist, remarked on the normalized degradation that is pervasive, as you remark, across the West. Normalized. So we see a canyon with a stream full of feces, with the banks degraded and
Mm-hmm.
the grass is gone,
Mm-hmm.
and we see a field of crested wheatgrass or cheatgrass, invasives, that are
Mm-hmm.
um, that are destructive to native flora, and we say, "Wow, look at that lovely field of grass! How rich, and beautiful it is."
I mean, it's just rampant ignorance about basic knowledge of how our landscape should look, and how these natural systems operate. And it's really, really frustrating. And you pointed out the fact that erosion produced by overgrazing since the middle of the 19th century was so significant that it was compared to a geological event. I mean, that's massive, people, and absolutely unacceptable.
Yeah, well, the transformation of the West begins. That is this geological event that results from overgrazing. Um, this massive erosion of soil begins in the 1860s, and so we don't even have a proper benchmark for what that landscape looked like prior
Mm-hmm.
to the cattle invasion. So we're really
Yeah, which was I was gonna say,
the dark,
like,
but you have pioneer accounts of landscapes that today are denuded um, and depauperate,
mhm,
but when those pioneers passed through those landscapes, they described grass that was so tall, and this is specific to southern parts of southern Utah, grass that was so tall that it touched the bellies of their horses. Now think of
yeah,
that.
yeah.
And then you go back to those same landscapes that were described as being so rich and lush, and there's it's
That's what I
just
was gonna
like
say.
wasteland.
Is that can you just imagine just how much more spectacular and stunning these Western landscapes, which are beautiful right now, would have looked had we never allowed cattle to graze upon them? It'd be mind blowing.
Yeah, well, we live in a world of vestiges
Mm-hmm.
um, and ruins
Mm-hmm.
in the West.
We do.
That landscape is a ruin, and is it's like a I don't know, it's like a, a wrecked temple,
Yeah.
and we have some bits and pieces of the temple, but we don't have what's there. However, if you get rid of the cattle and you just lay off and stop managing the land, it will recover.
Mm-hmm.
Not lifetimes, but it will recover.
Mm-hmm.
And you're an ecologist, you're a biologist, you know how resilient landscapes can be
Mm-hmm.
if left to their own
Be
devices
left be.
and if
Mm-hmm.
allowed to exert their own agency and freedom to heal
Mm-hmm.
and to return to some kind of normalcy.
And that's
For
all it takes. Like, remove the cows and the land will be fine. So ridiculously simple. As far as the beef industry, from the information you gathered, it's not even necessary to be grazing at all in the West. Less than 2% of beef is produced by public land grazed cattle. So if public land grazing was completely eliminated, it wouldn't even affect beef sales all that much since it isn't even really about beef sales, right?
no, I think it's about preserving, quote unquote, a way of life and a
Right.
culture,
Mm-hmm.
American heritage of the public lands cattlemen. So, uh, yeah, I mean, look, we shouldn't be eating beef at
Mm-hmm.
all, but for those who fetishize it and want to ruin their intestines and get cancer, yeah, if we ended all public lands grazing tomorrow, it would not change the price of beef. You can still have your steaks because most beef is husbanded in the temperate East,
Right.
where there's enough rain to
Where it's
to
suitable, where it's somewhat
rain.
suitable to bring in this invasive species yeah.
So yeah, and the reason that um, public lands grazing persists is because of the enormous political power of um, of the livestock industry, and it is actually separate from the economic power of this subset of agriculture. The economic importance of grazing, of public lands grazing, is very low in terms of jobs that the sector provides. They are few in terms of the tax revenues
Mm-hmm.
that the sector provides,
Mm-hmm.
also very low. So we're not talking about a rational cost benefit assessment here when we talk about the persistence and subsidization
Right.
of public lands grazing.
Boy, I mean,
It's
it
actually,
makes your just blood boil.
well, we must preserve the manly
Mm-hmm.
cowboy
Yeah,
who was out there.
you describe quite frankly these romanticized kind of eye-rolling descriptions of cowboys by historical figures such as Theodore Roosevelt, and which was kind of the birth of the romanticized cowboy image. He sort of saw them in this light that most people at the time didn't even see them as. They were not seen as these heroic, like, with this heroic, like, persona. So before Roosevelt's time, they were just kind of commonplace
Well,
people.
no, Cowboys were just filthy migrant laborers,
Hmm.
ill-paid, alcoholic, malnourished. But they were also, I mean, uh, look, all all folks who travel across the West in the 1870s, 1880s, um, felt that sense of uh, of verve and vigor
Hmm.
that comes with conquest, right?
Hmm.
We had just conquered these lands. We were the conquerors, and conquerors they are they swagger.
Yep.
They're full of energy and full of life because they've crushed the enemy. They've decimated the Native Americans. They've gotten rid of the buffalo. They brought in the cows. So that's what when Teddy Roosevelt saw these cowboys on the landscape, he wrote about them with an almost homoerotic fascination.
Right.
He was attracted to that masculinity, that conquering swagger.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, so it isn't really, since it isn't really about the beef, it's about this ridiculous effort to uphold tradition. And the consequences are
yeah, look,
huge.
right, right.
Yeah. Um, let's talk about the Bundys for a bit. I still can't believe you even met the guy. But explain just how much he's claimed for himself of public property and how much he still
Well,
owes.
first of all, Well, first of all, I assume your listeners know the whole backstory of the Clive and Bundy clan and their fight with the
They might
BLM over
not.
Grazing.
I don't think most people
Well, so
would.
Clive and Bundy became infamous across the West in 2014 when he basically organized an armed standoff against the BLM and Park Service officials and other federal law enforcement officials, when they tried to round up his illegally grazing cattle on an area of public land in the Mojave Desert called Gold Butte, which is about 70 miles north east of Las Vegas.
Hmm.
And so famously, he stood down. The BLM stood down. And the militiamen who pointed their weapons and said, "Hey, we're going to have a firefight here," and the government backed down.
Yeah.
Now you can imagine, of course, if the people pointing the guns at uh, federal law enforcement officials were like Black Panthers or I don't know,
Right.
American Indian Movement members, they'd be blown away.
Right. Right.
Okay, they would be killed.
Yeah.
But these are a bunch of white guys with cowboy hats. And so the government's like, wow, okay. Wait,
I mean, it is
that's
bizarre. It's
actually
it's so
for white guys with cowboy hats, it's okay for them to point guns
yeah.
at federal officials
Yeah.
and break.
And break the law. It's truly, truly bizarre, and uh,
In this case, and that's so important. That's why it's so important to understand here. It is the corruption of our government that is the most important thing here. Clive Bundy is nothing. He's an afterthought. He's a historical footnote. He's he's a dust mite.
mhm.
Okay. What matters is that you have gigantic corporations that work hand in glove with our government to violate federal laws, to undermine the regulation of those laws
Mhm.
on public lands, leaving an environmental mess
Right.
and leaving ecological destruction. So, Clive and Bundy, in terms of the narrative of my book, he was what Marx, or was it Lenin, used to call he was a useful idiot.
Mhm.
And that's, I think, how corporate America, that covets public lands, thinks of Clive and Bundy. He's a useful idiot. He spreads fear,
Mhm.
chaos, even terror
Mhm.
among BLM employees, while the corporations do the really dirty work, which is, um, get those get those mining leases, get the oil and gas drilling going, avoid the avoid, Clean Water and Clean Air Act regulations.
Mm-hmm.
Let's not do an EIS. Let's just rubber stamp the lease and start drilling. Um,
Yeah, I mean, when you see just how much these government agencies have let people get away, like the Bundys get away with, like, and just how much, like, they've backed down. I mean, even the FBI backs down in the face of a Bundyite. And it makes you think that there's, like, nothing that we can do then to stop this.
well, no, we have to demand that our elected officials
Right.
stand up for federal law
Mm-hmm.
and for environmental regulation. And if we pressure our elected officials, they in turn will pressure the agencies responsible for regulating public lands. So, meaning the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service. If you have a citizen uprising, peaceful, of course, that demands we protect our public lands for future generations. So if you have an upwelling of agitated citizens who demand that the law be followed and the land be protected, well, then you'll have a response
Yeah.
on the part of those elected officials and those federal regulators.
Yeah.
But if you have complacency and disregard and silence on the part of the citizenry, well, then the exploiters
Exploit.
and the pillagers will win.
Right. So don't stay quiet. Make a fuss about this because this is our.
Yeah, you gotta be pissed
Mm-hmm.
off, and you gotta make a fuss, and you gotta sound out. I was attacked in some of the reviews of my book as being too angry. Well,
You know what?
fucking a right,
It
I'm
was
angry.
perfectly.
Okay.
It was perfectly angry, Chris. I mean, I was right alongside there with you. In the name of our natural heritage, our natural wildlands heritage, I mean, yeah, who wouldn't want to be supportive of protecting our natural commons? And like I said, Chris, I had to prepare myself meditatively to read this book, and just for the sake of my own mind, my own emotions over this. So let's talk about what was the hardest for me, which was wildlife services. You dedicated a couple of chapters about wildlife services. And chapter 12 was really a hard chapter to get through. I had a few crying breaks. But it really needed to be written the way that it was, and I really appreciate you for that. So, there are a lot of species who suffer directly from public land grazing interests, including endangered species supposedly protected under the Endangered Species Act. So, can you talk about what Wildlife Services is and how they operate?
Wildlife Services is a branch of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, specifically a subgroup under the Animal, Plant, and Health Inspection Service, which is part of USDA. And its purpose in the American West, in the public lands of the American West, is to eradicate predators or eradicate those animals deemed to be predators and pests by the livestock industry. So, for example, Wildlife Services kills or has killed millions of coyotes,
Mm-hmm.
millions, literally, over the course of its operations. Wildlife Services has been around since the 1880s, I think 1886. I mean, it had a different name back then. It was called the Bureau of Economic Economic Ornithology or something. I forget the name, but anyways, it was So Wildlife Service has been around for a long time, and they have always had a single purpose of destroying wildlife that gets in the way of cattle grazing on the land. So, this is a panoply of wildlife. Um, so, for example, one of the earliest missions of wildlife services was to wipe out wolves, because as the white man invaded the West and started to kill out the native prey of wolves, wolves started then eating cows. And then the cattle industry said, we can't have them eating our cows, so we got to kill out the wolves. And that's what Wildlife Services did. Um, and then it went on to go after black bears and grizzly bears and wolverines and coyotes and lynx and bobcat and cougars, and man, it
It
just
just went
the
on and
list.
on and on and on, and
List is long.
a lot of keystone species as well. Um,
Yeah, well, that's what I was about to say.
mhm.
And so, also considered threats to the cattle industry are keystone species such as beavers, right? Because beavers dam up water that cattlemen need to water their cattle and grow hay. Or you have prairie dogs. Prairie dogs are considered a competitor with cattle because prairie dogs are foraging or use the same forage. Prairie dogs also create holes across the landscape that cows and horses can slip in and then break their legs. So we have to destroy the prairie dogs too, and on it goes.
Yeah, yeah, it's
Um,
pretty
this is what
formidable.
wildlife service. This is what wildlife services does.
Yeah.
They are an agency of slaughter,
Hmm.
epic slaughter, and brutal. and
Brutally
and
conducted too. I mean,
yeah.
read the book, please. People read the book. This, and just this total domination mentality. I mean, we're animals too. I mean, we're meant to thrive as well as all these other animals. And yeah, sure, there's this give and take of animals. Animals will die, and there's this cycle.
Yeah, but it's not but that's not domination.
Yeah,
That's just eating.
right. There's this cycle of
Hey,
life that happens, but this whole domination mentality is something that I'll never understand because it's just inherently unsustainable and just it's crazy. And the only reason humans behave this way, or humans believe that humans are meant to dominate the earth is and all of its living beings, is because of religious literature telling them so, which is what the Bundys often refer to, quoting scriptures to justify their illegal activities and this enormous slaughter.
hmm that's correct. Christianity, it's the Judeo-Christian view as expressed in Genesis. I think it's 127, 126, in which God comes down and says, I bequeath to you all the animals of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh yeah, really?
Mm-hmm.
I think God sounds like he's nuts.
God sounds like he's nuts. Yeah. Yep.
God sounds like a maniac. So God says to man, oh yeah, you can have every creepy crawling thing on the earth is yours
Mm-hmm.
for your raiment and your food and and and.
Yeah.
So that's the view. The view is one of the Judeo-Christian view of nature is that it is a resource to be exploited for the sole benefit of the one chosen species, Homo sapiens,
Mm-hmm.
which is just that is the attitude, as you just noted, that is going to lead to civilizational suicide
Right.
as we face the consequences of our total domination of planet Earth and our poisoning of the atmosphere with carbon pollutants.
Yeah.
And climate change Mother Earth will rise up and shake off this plague of fleas called humanity,
Yeah.
and we'll pay the price in the end. It's not we won't see it, but 100 years from now, 150 years from now, yeah, we're going to be in big trouble.
Definitely, people read this book. From me to you, please read this book. It's not just, it's primarily like you said, it's primarily livestock, but there's oil and gas industries to blame. It's also political gaming, it's logging, it's outdoor recreation industries as well. Basically, wherever and however wild places can be compromised in the name of profit is where these threats are. So let's move on to recreation. The recreational use of wilderness and the fact that it's too gone too far.
Yeah. Well, well, I was just reading a great piece just now, right before you called, a great piece by my friend Mark Sundin, who writes for Outside Magazine. And he's a journalist and author. And in his piece, it's about, I'll read you the title. It is, um, just give me a second here, pull it up. Let's see. Utah wanted all the tourists, then it got them. Uh, well, yeah, Utah is overrun with tourism, with recreational, use. So, and what's happened to the national parks there? They've become zoos of humanity. They are overwhelmed with traffic, with idling cars, with
Off-roading.
mobs of people. Backcountry trails that were once quiet redoubts of solitude and solace are now packed with, tour groups. Um,
Yeah, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. You said how do you pronounce his name? Howard Sennheiser?
Howard Sennheiser, yeah. Howard Sennheiser is one of the main authors of the Wilderness Act. I mean, there are many, many, many people who contributed to the various drafts of the Wilderness Act, but Howard Sennheiser is generally credited as being the prime mover of the Wilderness Act in Congress, and it's and the guy who really drafted the who came up with the first draft of the bill and
When
then worked on until its passage in 1964.
Yeah, and he said in a congressional testimony in 1962 that, quote, recreation is not necessarily the dominant use of area of wilderness, that it should be of pivotal importance that the purpose of the Wilderness Act is to preserve the wilderness character, not to establish any particular use. And yet, guess what we have today? We have USDA Forest Service's motto, the land of many uses, proclaiming that basically we are to make use of our public land and national forests in ways not aligned with the Wilderness Act. So he spoke about the spiritual value and, the solace that you can find in the wild and the importance of finding that solitude in such places. Which,
Right.
mhm,
So look, Sennheiser's point was that wilderness should be protected for the sake of wilderness, not for the sake of backpackers
mhm,
or uh, or wilderness guides or for any industrial or extractive or profiteering interest. The whole point was to leave the land alone. That's what the Wilderness Act does.
right,
Now you have to make clear for readers that the land of many uses, as the Forest Service refers to its domain, um, does not is not for the most part wilderness. Wilderness is a separate category
yes.
of protection. So you've got national forests where you've got the many uses. You've got recreation, off-road vehicle use,
That's
logging,
true. I
grazing.
misquoted there a little bit. Wildernesses are within national forests and
Yeah, within forest, I mean, wildernesses are all over the place. They're in national parks. They're on the
right.
BLM lands. They're within wildlife refuges.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the point of the wilderness, the point of a wilderness protection is to allow for the land to remain itself, to allow land to have agency and to be. And this is the key phrase of the Wilderness Act: for the land to be untrammeled.
Yes.
Now, what does trammeled mean? To trammel something is to hobble it. To trammel something is to make it unfree. So, an untrammeled landscape is a free landscape. And that's why Sennheiser's language is so beautiful. Because he didn't say pristine. He didn't say, he didn't, he just said, just leave it be. Just stop meddling. Stop getting your greasy little mitts on everything, Homo sapiens. Just let it be, you know? And that's like, hand out of the cookie jar,
Mm-hmm.
people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so the consequences of making wilderness too accessible are huge. I mean, I'm a backpacker, as you might have imagined, but these visitor centers to these national parks they just drive me nuts. They're just full of junk and garbage in the form of keychains and just garbage, and that's what they're sending people off with, that message of just garbage.
Well, there's got to make some money.
Yep.
Got to make money off the wilderness. Got to make money off the national parks. You got all those little concessionaire. You got the concessionaires, Xanterra, and others. You got the hotel complexes, the restaurant, all the restaurants, the and the trinket shops. You got the tour guides, the wilderness guides, the backpacking guides, the horse packing guides.
Yeah.
You got to make money, right? It's all about making money
it's a bunch of junk. So it's funny that you just published today. This is January 30th. This episode's not going to be out today, but an article in LA Times about the destruction of pinyon juniper forests in the West. The Forest Service is doing this too, maybe with BLM, I'm not sure. But I worked for the Forest Service for a very short time, and it was a horrible experience. My worst job experience ever. And it was like I was working for the devil, or I was working for the bad guy. And
can you tell me?
I worked as a wildlife technician, and I conducted surveys for threatened and endangered bird species along the Verde River, or as they say, Verde River in Arizona. And it was just horrible. And I've seen this widespread clearing of juniper woodlands, and it's devastating. And of course, if I ask anybody about it, what is this for, they say it's juniper encroachment treatment. And of course it's clearing land for more cattle.
Yeah. How long did you work for the Forest Service?
Less than a season. I mean, it was so horrific.
Wow.
I was doing bird surveys for threatened and endangered bird species. It just was insane. I mean, the environment was... I didn't fit. I didn't belong in that environment. Because I actually cared about the forest, and I cared about wildlife, and I just saw so much from the inside in such a short amount of time, and including this Forest Service employee and rancher buddy system, and it just blew my mind because, for instance, cows are not supposed to be on the river, let alone a wild and scenic river, the Verde River. And I was told that when you see these cows or down fences, to report it to range, and But then again, I was told, but don't really do that because they don't want to hear it. It sounds like you're just complaining. So I'm not supposed to do my job, and they're not doing their job to actually keep cattle out of delicate areas, because there's this buddy system with the ranchers, and it drove, it's true. It's so true. I saw it firsthand, and it was terrible. Yeah.
Wow. I wonder if someday you might write about your experience at the Forest Service.
Well, I have written a little. I wrote on the Wandering Naturalist, my blog, about that experience, but I didn't really tie it into the Forest Service all that much. It was kind of fresh out of the experience, but it was just, our work with the birds sort of ended, and then they were going to transfer me to range, and I was like, oh, heck no. So I was out of there. Because I would have been the one that says, it's overgrazed, it's overgrazed, it's overgrazed. I mean, in that experience, I saw forests that absolutely were just dead, Chris. I mean, they were lifeless. Thinned so much that no wildlife could thrive in it. And, one of the surveys that I did was for the Mexican spotted owl, which, is highly threatened and depends upon old growth forests. And there's just this lack of care. Like, I feel like the wildlife biology department was just created for looks,
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Absolutely. To create the imprimatur of oversight.
Yeah.
To present to the public the veneer of regulation.
Yeah.
When in fact the real purpose is simply to obfuscate and ultimately lie to the public about what's going on, what the management program is really intended for, right? So they talk about, you read through these EISs and EAs, and you read through these documents that describe a management program such as you had to deal with at the Forest Service, and it'll just be all full of just phonied up language of falsehood
Oh yeah.
and trick and deceitful
Oh,
language.
absolutely.
Vegetation treatments.
Yeah.
What what's a vegetation treatment, man? It's poisoning,
Hmm.
burning, mulching, bulldozing.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
and for what? To improve
But I tell
forage.
you what, it was the most soul crushing experience of my life because I took my job very seriously and my data collection very seriously. And, the real big bad wolves lurk behind the names of these land and wildlife management agencies, including the Forest Service. And that's not to say the technicians are bad, because there's a lot of good people in the Forest Service that want to do good work. The Forest Service doesn't serve the forest. I've always thought of it as this, is that the Forest Service rather serves up the forest in the form of timber to big companies, acting on compromise or grazing land. These agencies are greenwashing at its finest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're gonna love the latest piece I'm working. Well, first of all, let me say I wish I'd interviewed you for my book, because the most important sources for that book were those employees like yourself who worked at BLM, who worked at the Forest Service, and who took their job seriously, who had a land ethic, who were biocentric in their view of the natural world, and found their souls, as you say,
Yeah.
destroyed from having to labor under bosses whose view was the complete opposite.
Yeah, it was
Right? Whose
horrible.
view, no, we're not here to protect to protect the land. What, are you kidding
Yeah.
me?
Yeah, it was just totally devastating. I feel dirtied by it, by the
Uh-huh.
experience.
And and I bet you thought to yourself going in, this is going to be glorious. I'm
Yes.
working for the Forest Service,
Yes. Well, what
right?
happened was I had heard stories about the Forest Service and didn't take them all to heart and thought, I bet you it's not that bad, and if it is, I could get in there and make a difference. No way, no how. The system is rigged, for one thing. It works alongside all these other agencies. I went to as part of my job, a presentation from the Fish and Wildlife Services. And I thought, oh, great, this is going to be great, because these are going to be the people that actually care. These are going to be the experts. And it was a presentation about the yellow-billed cuckoo, which is one of the birds we were surveying.
And by the way, the yellow-billed cuckoo is one of the native species that livestock grazing has driven to
Yes.
near extinction, correct?
Yes. And so
Yeah.
so what I realized in that was this, presentation about the yellow-billed cuckoo, and there were some yellow-billed cuckoo experts and things like that. But basically it was the Fish and Wildlife Services telling us, well, we got to be sure not to overprotect the yellow-billed cuckoo because of other interests. And I was like, what? And at this point, I was thinking, gosh, you can't overprotect hardly anything today. Everything's threatened. And the room got quiet. Nobody said a thing. It was really bizarre. And she was showing us aerial images of these riparian systems in which I worked. And, you see these thin stretches of cottonwood, and which of course are adjacent to agricultural land. So clearly their best interest wasn't the yellow-billed
Oh.
cuckoo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But then you learned who you were really working for.
Yes, I did. Absolutely. It's insane. It's
Yeah.
insane. And then I came out and I said it's all freaking true. um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I knew you had heard your share of those kind of stories, and but it was nice to get it off my chest anyway. Thank you. A friend
Well,
of mine who I worked with actually likes to call us Forest Service survivors.
mm, you know what I would love to do? I would love to do an article, just a standalone article called Forest Service Survivors,
Yeah.
and have it be a profile of maybe 5 different people, yourself included, perhaps,
Yeah.
and just talk about the experience of going into this agency and then having your soul ripped out because of the utter disappointment.
They're just this absolute opposite of what they lead the public to believe they are.
Right, right, right. It's all Smokey Bear and the Lorax, and protect the trees, and the funny the nice hats and the green outfits, and everyone's green. We're all
Mm-hmm.
green.
Mm-hmm. Well, getting back to public land grazing, could you kind of explain how these horrendous operations that we talked about earlier are being paid for by the public? Like, what do those figures look like?
Oh, so we were talking earlier about how the public lands grazing provides forage for something like 2% of all beef produced in the United States. But at the same time, state and federal governments massively subsidize um, the public lands grazing industry to the tune of an estimated $1 billion a year. So we're talking about under market grazing fees, uh, road building, fence building, water diversions, dams, pipelines, water pipelines, um, animal control via wildlife services, and on and on. Weed uh, weed control, invasive species management, um, all the vegetation treatments. Don't forget those.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or the kind of stuff that I wrote about in my LA Times op-ed published today. The taxpayer funds BLM to send bull hogs out into the landscape. What's a bull hog? Well, it's a bulldozer with a gigantic spinning blade or spinning cylinder um, affixed at its front end, and it marches through a forest and destroys the forest. Literally, just it's a mobile mulcher, and it just literally you come up to a stand of pinyon juniper trees, and the trees collapse, and then the spinning bladed cylinder chews them up and then spits them out the ass end of the bullhog. Um, I witnessed this in action. I could not believe the speed with which this machine wiped out a stand of pinyon junipers. They're just gone, like minutes. The forest is gone, and I'm standing like, whoa, whoa.
Yeah.
I mean, I laugh, but I laugh in horror
Yeah.
and pain.
Yeah.
Uh, to this agonizing destruction unfolding so quickly and so thoughtlessly.
Yeah. And this is
Uh,
what we're paying for.
right, and so this is all. So what was that bull hog doing? Well, this is a vegetation treatment to allow for more cattle forage.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the program.
Yeah, it is.
Of course, it's as I said earlier, it's all couched, however, in deceitful
It
language,
all is. All of it.
yeah, in tricky parlance. So they'll say, well, we're destroying these pinyon juniper stands to open up more land for sage grouse,
Mm-hmm.
so that sage brush can reoccupy this land that has been in quote unquote encroached upon by pinyon juniper, when in fact historical records do not show any evidence of encroachment in
I
that
mean,
particular
I knew
stand.
that was BS, and it just becomes what they say, and then everybody else
Yeah,
repeats
the,
it.
the encroachment uh, the encroachment justification for these programs for the destruction of pinyon juniper all across the West is oftentimes just a lie. Um, and so they claim that they're creating habitat for sage grouse. But if you look at the science, if you look at the evidence for these claims, it's nothing. It's just a bunch of air. Or it's the work of what a friend of mine who has tangled with the Forest Service and the BLM, of what he calls the biostitutes, right? The biologists who serve their master, their paymaster, and do what they're told and produce the kind of deceitful science that is then used to justify what are, in fact, ecologically untenable um, positions.
Well, I've seen that too, and I've worked under. Yes, I've seen this too. I've seen biologists and ecologists know that what they're doing is not the best, and they do it anyway, for the sake of the job. And yeah, pretty horrific.
Money.
It's all about money, yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Money.
and in the meantime, I'm not making anything talking about this. It's just, I mean, I'm
All the good
making a
people.
little bit, but
No,
nothing
all the
really.
people are broke,
Huh?
Sarai. Okay,
I'm
that's
sorry?
it. All the good people are broke.
Yeah.
All the good people have no money. They don't make a lot of money. If if you when
Chris.
you see people who are all well dressed and making a lot of
Hmm.
money, then there's probably a
Oh,
problem.
yeah. I mean, from the moment I expressed my interest in biology and wanting to pursue a career in biology, I mean, I always got that from people. It's like, oh, well,
Sure.
there's no money in that. And I'm like, well, for one thing, that's not why I'm pursuing it. And then, I knew what I was getting into.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I'm
absolutely.
grateful that I got the education that I got. And I'm grateful that I have the, perspective that I have. So,
Yeah, well, biology doesn't pay, but at least you have two things on your side: truth and beauty. And as Yeats says, or Keats says, that's all you need to know:
mm-hmm.
truth and beauty.
Well, thank you. Is there anything else, Chris, you might like to add before I ask you my last standard question that I ask all of my guests?
Uh-oh. No, just ask away. Go
Okay.
for it.
So, in the effort to possibly end this on a good note,
Awesome.
in in and in honor of all the wild things that we love, I would like to ask you, Chris, if you could share with us a story about a special experience or connection you have made in nature or with an animal.
Oh man, how many? It's too many to choose from. But you know what? I'll just talk about the forest in my backyard. So I live in the Catskill Mountains, adjacent to the Catskill Forest Preserve and near state public lands, including watershed lands that are protected and the forever wild lands that are enclosed in the Catskill Preserve. But these are all landscapes that were heavily logged, whose forests were nearly destroyed, but for the efforts of some of the earliest conservationists in this country who established the Catskill Preserve and the Adirondack Forest Preserve. And so one of the species of trees that has been nearly wiped out, or was nearly wiped out from the Catskills, is the eastern white pine, Pinus glaucus, which is a spectacular tree. And you have to imagine what life must have been like in these mountains before Whitey came in and chopped down the eastern white pines, because they were legion. They were everywhere, and they were enormous, towering trees with trunks 6 feet wide. I mean, or 6 feet in diameter. So in the on the public land adjacent to my property, there is one last eastern white pine standing. And I go to visit it. I go to visit it practically every day, and I just pay homage to Mr. Pinus glaucus, who is still glorious and towering and utterly beautiful beyond words. So there's my experience.
Beautiful. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for talking with me today about this.
Yeah, well, thanks for the conversation. It was a good one.
So remember to check out the book This Land by Christopher Ketcham. This is Wild Roots. Thanks for listening. If you don't agree with how our public lands are being managed, based on what we've discussed in this interview, and if you have the chance to read This Land, you will get a better understanding about what has been happening. But if you don't agree with this massive government-assisted slaughter of native wildlife and plant populations in our public commons for livestock, make your voice heard. Get in touch with your elected officials. Make it clear that you do not support this. Because right now, billions of tax-paying dollars are being used to conduct these horrendous operations. Say something. Don't stay quiet. Because if we do, we will lose our wildlands heritage. And that is not the legacy that I want to leave behind. That is not our Wild Roots way. Thank you again for listening.